They never saw him coming. One by one, they vanished. Young women full of life, dreams, and laughter, girls who had futures ahead of them. But something was hunting them. A shadow moving through the streets of Seattle, picking them off like prey. At first, no one noticed. Women in the margins of society, prostitutes and runaways, disappear without a trace. Then, the bodies started to surface. It began in the summer of 1982. The Green River ran cold, its waters a silent witness to the horror beneath its surface. A worker at a local meatpacking plant stepped outside for a cigarette, the morning air crisp as he walked toward the riverbank. But what he saw that day would haunt him forever. A body, floating, lifeless, caught between the rocks. The police were called, and soon, a gruesome pattern began to unfold. More bodies, women, and girls were dumped into the river and discarded like garbage. Some were nude, others weighed down by heavy stones. A cruel attempt to keep them hidden, to let the current carry them away. But the river, as it turned out, wasn't willing to keep his secret. Seattle police knew they had a problem. What they didn't know was that they had just stumbled into the beginning of one of the longest and most haunting manhunts in American history. This is the story of the Green River Killer, a man who killed more than Ted Bundy, more than Jeffrey Dahmer, and who, despite decades of investigations, almost got away with it. Before they became victims, they were daughters, sisters, mothers, and friends. They had stories, lives. Marcia Chapman had always been a fighter. She had children she loved, a family that worried about her, and a laugh that could brighten a room. She wasn't perfect, no one is, but she was a survivor. The streets of Seattle weren't kind to women like her, and she did what she had to do to get by. Opal Mills was only 16, a teenager with dreams, a girl who should have had her whole life ahead of her. Her family had no idea that the next time they would see her, it would be in a morgue, her body bruised and lifeless. Cynthia Hines, Deborah Bonner, and so many others were human beings before they became statistics. They had families who loved them, people who waited for them to come home. But one after another, they disappeared, swallowed by the streets, their final moments spent in terror. And then the phone calls started. Families reaching out to the police, desperate for answers. Where was their daughter? Their sister? Their mother? The silence that followed was unbearable. The police were overwhelmed. The bodies kept coming, but the leads were dead ends. The killer was careful. He left no fingerprints, no eyewitnesses, no clear pattern aside from his choice of victims. For the detectives assigned to the case, it felt like a losing battle. Dave Reichert was one of them, a young investigator who would spend the next 2 decades chasing the man responsible. He would remember everybody he pulled from the river, every face that haunted his nights. You could go from one end of the Pacific Highway to the other and count 100 prostitutes, Reichert later recalled, and every time you turned around, another body was found. Despite the gruesome evidence piling up, the case refused to crack open. The killer had perfected his craft. He didn't lure victims with charm, like Bundy. He didn't dismember them, like Dahmer. He was methodical and efficient, a predator in plain sight. Then, finally, a break. One of the women working the streets came forward. She had survived an attack, barely. She gave the police a description, a name: Gary Ridgeway. At first glance, Gary Ridgeway was no one special, just an average man. A truck painter, married, quiet. He wasn't the type to stand out, which was exactly what made him so dangerous. He had a wife and a son. He attended church, and his neighbors never suspected a thing. But beneath the surface, Ridgeway was hiding something far darker. He was obsessed with prostitutes, not just in a way that made him a regular customer, but in a way that made him dangerous. He thought they were beneath him, disposable. He used them, then discarded them, and as the years went by, he got better at it. Police brought him in for questioning, but there was nothing solid tying him to the murders. They searched his home, his truck, his locker at work. Nothing. He was careful. He left no evidence behind. And so, Ridgeway walked free. For years, the case went cold. The bodies stopped turning up, but that didn't mean the killer had stopped. Investigators worked tirelessly, but without new leads, there was a little they could do. The families of the victims lived in agony, wondering if their loved ones would ever get justice. But then, science caught up with the past. DNA technology had advanced, and suddenly the evidence collected decades ago had something to say. The samples taken from the Green River victims were tested again, and this time there was a match. Gary Ridgeway. The police wasted no time. They put him under surveillance, watching as he circled the streets, still eyeing the women he had spent his life preying on. It was clear he hadn't stopped. It was a rainy day when they made their move. Ridgeway was at work, walking toward his truck when detectives closed in. "You're under arrest for the murder of several women in King County." He didn't resist, because he knew it was over. What came next was chilling. In court, Ridgeway admitted to everything. 48 murders, 48 lives were stolen. And then he said something that made the entire courtroom go silent. "I killed so many women, I have a hard time keeping them straight." It wasn't just 48, it was 70, maybe more. He had no remorse and no emotion when asked why he chose prostitutes. His answer was brutally honest. "Because I thought I could kill as many as I wanted without getting caught." In the end, he was spared the death penalty in exchange for his full confession. Instead, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would die behind bars. For the families of the victims, the trial was both an end and a beginning. Some screamed at him in court, pouring out their anger. Others told him they forgave him. One woman looked him in the eyes and said, "You are forgiven." Another said, "I hope you rot in hell." And just like that, it was over. Gary Ridgeway, the most prolific serial killer in American history, was locked away, never to see freedom again. Evil doesn't always look like a monster sometimes. It looks like the man next door, a father, a co-worker, and a neighbor. For 20 years, Gary Ridgeway walked among us, hunting, killing, and blending in. He got away with it because no one thought to look at him twice. How many more are out there? How many predators are hiding in plain sight? This story ended with justice, but there are more like him. And the question we should all be asking is, will we see them coming next time? If you found this story chilling, if you believe in justice for the victims, share this. Keep their names alive. And, most importantly, always be aware, evil hides in the most ordinary places. Because the next Gary Ridgeway, he could be out there right now, watching, waiting. Who will stop him? On a foggy June night in 1985, in the quiet town of Nixa, Missouri, a young woman vanished without a trace. Her car was found abandoned, soaked in blood, her belongings scattered inside, but she was nowhere to be found. For days, her family clung to hope, imagining she had simply run out of gas or stayed with a friend. But when two fishermen made a gruesome discovery in a nearby lake, their worst fears were confirmed. What followed was a decades-long mystery, one filled with dead ends, chilling suspicions, and a killer who walked free, untouchable. That is, until 22 years later, when a single drop of DNA would finally crack the case wide open. This is the story of Jackie Johns, the vibrant young woman whose life was stolen, and the relentless pursuit of justice that ensured her killer would never hurt another soul again. Jackie Johns was the kind of person who lit up a room the moment she walked in. At just 20 years old, she was full of life. Beautiful, confident, and deeply loved by everyone who knew her. Born and raised in Nixa, Missouri, a quiet town nestled in the Ozarks, Jackie had that rare kind of charm that made her unforgettable. She worked as a waitress at the Nixa Sale Barn Cafe, a local spot where farmers, ranchers, and everyday folks gathered for a warm meal and friendly conversation. Jackie wasn't just another waitress, she was a favorite. With her bright smile and easygoing personality, she made sure everyone felt welcome. Whether it was the cowboys tracking dirt and manure into the cafe or the local businessman grabbing a quick lunch, Jackie treated them all the same, with kindness and a little bit of playful flirtation. Outside of work, Jackie had big dreams. She loved competing in beauty pageants and had even been crowned the winner of the Sucker Day pageant. She had a strong sense of style, a contagious laugh, and a heart full of ambition. But more than anything, she was a devoted daughter, sister, and friend. Her best friend, Lisa Thompson, remembers the night Jackie disappeared all too well. It was a foggy evening, thick with an eerie stillness. Jackie had called Lisa's house asking if she wanted to go out when she got off work. But Lisa's mother refused, saying, "It's foggy enough. There's liable to be a murder tonight, and you're not going anywhere." At the time, it seemed like an overprotective mother's warning, just another night in their small town. But those words would soon haunt Lisa forever. June 17th, 1985, started like any other day. Jackie had worked her shift at the cafe, laughing and joking with her regulars. After work, she was last seen at a local 7-Eleven convenience store, picking up a few things before heading home. But she never made it there. The next morning, concern began to creep in. Jackie wasn't answering her phone. She hadn't shown up at home. That wasn't like her. Then a call came in. Jackie's black Camaro had been found abandoned on US 160, just outside of town. When police arrived at the scene, they were met with a disturbing sight. Inside the car, blood was everywhere. The passenger seat, the floorboards, stained deep red. It was immediately clear that something horrific had happened. There was no sign of Jackie, but her clothes, her jeans, blouse, and undergarments were there, soaked in blood. Her friends and family clung to hope. Maybe she had been attacked and left somewhere, injured but alive. Maybe she had managed to escape. Maybe, just maybe, she would come home. But 4 days later, hope turned to heartbreak. On June 22, 1985, two fishermen were out on Lake Springfield, a quiet body of water just a few miles from where Jackie's car had been found. They spotted something floating in the distance. As they got closer, their stomachs dropped. It was a body, a young woman, nude, lifeless, drifting in the water. Authorities arrived and there was no question. It was Jackie Johns. The autopsy revealed the horrifying truth. Jackie had suffered severe blunt force trauma to the head. She had been beaten, likely with a car jack, before being sexually assaulted and dumped in the lake like garbage. The town of Nixa was shaken to its core. How could this happen to her? Who could have done something so cruel? Jackie's family was devastated. Her parents, Jean and Les Johns, were forced to bury their daughter, knowing her final moments had been filled with terror and pain. At her funeral, the church was packed. Friends, family, and townspeople came together, all mourning the loss of a young woman who had been taken far too soon. But grief soon turned to determination. Someone had done this. Someone had stolen Jackie's life, and they weren't going to get away with it. The investigation began immediately. Sheriff Dwight McNeil, just 33 years old and new to the job, was tasked with solving the most brutal crime Nixa had ever seen. One of the first people he questioned was Jackie's boyfriend, Cody. He was a quiet, rugged cowboy, a few years older than Jackie, and in the process of a divorce. Some thought he might be a jealous lover, but after questioning him, police found no evidence linking him to the crime. Then a lead came in. Several witnesses reported seeing a very specific vehicle parked across from the 7-Eleven on the night Jackie disappeared, a white and blue Chevrolet Cheyenne pickup truck. It didn't take long for Sheriff McNeil to realize who it belonged to: Gerald Carnahan. Gerald Carnahan wasn't just some random guy in town. He was the son of a powerful businessman, part of a wealthy and influential family that owned a successful foundry in Nixa. Carnahan was well known, but not for the right reasons. He had a reputation for being arrogant, entitled, and predatory toward young women. Some even whispered about his obsession with Jackie. And now, multiple witnesses had placed his truck at the scene of her disappearance. But when questioned, Carnahan denied everything. He claimed he was at home that night. His stepdaughter provided an alibi, saying he had been with her the whole time. Without physical evidence tying him to the crime, police had no choice but to let him go. And just like that, Jackie's case went cold. Years passed. Her family never stopped searching for answers, but every lead dried up. It seemed like her killer had gotten away with it. Until 2 decades later, when a single drop of DNA would finally bring Gerald Carnahan to justice. By 2007, forensic technology had advanced far beyond what was available in 1985. Investigators decided to revisit Jackie's case, submitting evidence for DNA testing. And then the breakthrough came. The DNA recovered from Jackie's body matched Gerald Carnahan. Authorities wasted no time. Carnahan was arrested and charged with Jackie's murder. This time, there was no escaping justice. During the trial in 2010, prosecutors laid out the chilling facts. Witnesses placed Carnahan at the scene. DNA placed him inside Jackie, and his history of violence, including a later conviction for attempted kidnapping, proved what kind of man he was. The jury didn't take long. On September 23, 2010, after 25 years of walking free, Gerald Carnahan was found guilty of first-degree murder and rape. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. For Jackie's family, it wasn't closure. They would never get her back. But it was justice. Carnahan's appeals have all been denied. Today, he sits behind bars at the Jefferson City Correctional Center, where he will remain for the rest of his life. Jackie Johns was a daughter, a sister, a friend, a young woman with dreams and a future, a life stolen by a man who thought he was untouchable. But in the end, justice found him. And for the town of Nixa, for Jackie's family, and for every young woman who ever felt afraid walking alone at night, his conviction was proof that even the coldest of cases can still be solved. Jackie Johns may be gone, but her story will never be forgotten. Jackie Johns' story is one of heartbreak, resilience, and justice. She was a young woman full of life and promise, taken far too soon by a man who thought he could get away with it. For over 2 decades, her family carried the weight of unanswered questions, living with the pain of not knowing if her killer would ever be held accountable. But they never gave up. And thanks to advancements in forensic science, dedicated investigators, and the unwavering love of a community that refused to forget her, justice was finally served. Gerald Carnahan may have walked free for 25 years, but the truth caught up with him. His conviction stands as a reminder that no matter how much time passes, no crime is beyond solving, and no victim should ever be forgotten. But Jackie's case also raises a critical issue. How many other cold cases remain unsolved? How many families are still waiting for justice? If Jackie's story teaches us anything, it's that persistence matters. Advances in DNA technology continue to change the way cases are solved, but they require funding, support, and public awareness. If you believe in justice for victims like Jackie, consider supporting organizations that work to solve cold cases. Advocate for the use of forensic advancements in law enforcement. And, most importantly, if you ever have information about a missing person or an unsolved crime, speak up. Your voice could be the key to unlocking the truth. Jackie Johns was more than a victim. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend. Her story reminds us that justice, no matter how long it takes, is always worth fighting for. And for those still waiting for answers, the fight is not over. It was a warm September afternoon in East Harlem, and 13-year-old Paula Hilera was walking home from school. She was a bright, ambitious girl, full of energy, with dreams of one day becoming a doctor. Her family had immigrated to Colombia just a few years earlier, searching for better opportunities, and Paula had embraced her new life with enthusiasm. She was well-liked among her classmates, loved to dance, and often helped her younger siblings with their homework. To her family, she was more than just a daughter. She was their hope for the future. But that hope was shattered when she didn't come home that evening. At first, her mother assumed she had simply stayed late with friends. But as the hours stretched on and calls to her went unanswered, worry turned to panic. The family searched the neighborhood, knocking on doors, calling out her name, asking anyone if they had seen their little girl. But no one had. It was as if Paula had vanished into thin air. Then a call came in that no parent should ever have to receive. A man, walking his dog along a footpath near the East River, had stumbled upon something horrifying: a young girl's body lying motionless beneath a footbridge. Police arrived within minutes, and among them was Detective Gary Dugan. As he examined the scene, he noticed that her hands were placed at her sides as if she had been gently laid down. There were no immediate signs of trauma, but as an ambulance technician carefully lifted her sweater, the gruesome truth was revealed. She had been stabbed in the chest. And there was something even more chilling. A ligature was wrapped tightly around her neck. The absence of blood at the scene suggested that this wasn't where she had died. Someone had killed Paula elsewhere and then discarded her body like an object, left to be found by a stranger. Her family's worst fears were confirmed when they were called in to identify her. Their bright, beautiful girl was gone. While detectives struggled to find leads, another tragedy was unfolding just days later. A fire broke out on the rooftop of the George Washington housing complex in Harlem. Firefighters arrived and quickly doused the flames, assuming it was nothing more than a pile of burning trash. But as the smoke cleared, they made a horrific discovery. What lay in the ashes was not garbage, it was a human body, burned beyond recognition, drenched in gasoline. Someone had tried to erase their crime in the most brutal way possible. It didn't take long to identify the victim. She was Yohalis Castro, an 18-year-old girl from the Bronx. Yohalis had been missing for several days. She had last been seen alive making a phone call from her home, setting up a meeting with someone she trusted. That trust had led her to her death. Detectives immediately began retracing her final steps. Phone records showed that in the hours before she disappeared, Yohalis had been in contact with a woman named Cynthia Key, who lived in East Harlem. When detectives questioned Cynthia, she claimed not to know Yohalis. However, she did mention that her son, Aaron Malik Key, might have some connection to her. The detectives ran Aaron's name through their system and found that he had a history of robbery and time spent in a correctional facility. But at that moment, there was no hard evidence linking him to Yohalis's murder. With no immediate proof, the case, like Paula's, eventually went cold. A year passed. Then the nightmare returned. It was early morning at the Taft housing projects, and a resident was making her way down the stairs, forced to walk due to the elevators being out of order. As she reached the 15th floor landing, she saw what appeared to be a woman lying down. At first, she assumed the woman was simply asleep, but as she stepped closer, the truth became horrifyingly clear. The woman wasn't sleeping. She was dead. The police were called, and soon detectives Scott Wagner and Mike Ulaco arrived at the scene. The victim was lying on her back, partially covered with a shirt as if someone had tried to hide her even in death. Underneath, she was completely nude. Her body was quickly transported to the medical examiner's office, where she was identified as 18-year-old Rashida Washington, a local resident known for her kindness and infectious laugh. Rashida had disappeared the night before while walking home. The autopsy revealed that she had been strangled, and there were clear signs that she had been sexually assaulted. But this time, the killer had left behind something that would change the course of the investigation forever: DNA. Detectives now had the biological fingerprint of a murderer, but without a suspect, it was just a clue waiting to be matched. Months passed, and the case lingered. Then, in a breakthrough moment, forensic scientist Karen Dooling ran Rashida Washington's DNA sample against the city's crime database. The results were shocking. The same DNA had been collected from another case, an unsolved rape identified only as Rape Victim 1. That single match cracked the case wide open. With this discovery, investigators began linking Rashida Washington's murderer to a series of brutal rapes in East Harlem. Each victim described a terrifyingly similar pattern: forced into secluded areas, blindfolded, gagged with their own clothing, and subjected to horrifying sexual assaults. Word spread through the community. Witnesses came forward, and one name kept coming up: Ace. Ace was a street nickname, but when detectives dug deeper, they uncovered who it belonged to: Aaron Key, the same Aaron Key who had been connected to Johannes Castro's final phone call, the same Aaron Key whose mother had spoken to detectives and dismissed any involvement. Now they had their prime suspect, but they needed proof. Investigators arrested Key on a petty larceny charge, hoping to keep him in custody while they built their case. In his holding cell, detectives cleverly collected 5 styrofoam cups that he had used and sent them for DNA testing. The results were definitive. Key's DNA was a perfect match to the semen collected from Rashida Washington and the rape victims. Then came the final blow. A single pubic hair found on Paula Hilera's body was sent for mitochondrial DNA testing. It was a match to Aaron Key. After years of evading justice, his killing spree had finally come to an end. On the day of his arrest, Key showed no fear, no remorse. As detectives presented the mountain of evidence against him, he simply smirked. When asked about his victims, he responded with chilling indifference. The trial was one of the most closely watched in New York. The families of the victims packed the courtroom, many clutching photographs of the daughters they had lost. Some wept quietly, others sat in silence, their grief too deep for words. The prosecution laid out the gruesome details of Key's crimes, painting a picture of a sadistic predator who had stalked and terrorized women for years. In the end, the jury delivered the only possible verdict: guilty. Aaron Key was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder of Rashida Washington. He was given additional 25 to life sentences for the murders of Johannes Castro and Paula Hilera. On top of that, he received 475 years for the rapes. He was sent to Attica Correctional Facility, a maximum security prison known for housing some of the most dangerous criminals in the state. For the victims' families, there was no true solace. Nothing could bring back their daughters. But there was justice. They could finally rest knowing that the man who had brought them so much pain would never hurt another soul again. When asked about his crimes, Key never showed remorse. But for the families, his lack of emotion didn't matter. What mattered was that he was gone, locked away forever. Paula, Johannes, and Rashida were not just victims. They were daughters, sisters, friends, and because of DNA and the determination of investigators who refused to let their cases go cold, their killer was finally behind bars. Forever. The case of Aaron Key is a chilling reminder that monsters don't always lurk in the shadows. Sometimes they live among us, hiding in plain sight. For years, he terrorized East Harlem, preying on young women with no regard for the lives he destroyed. But in the end, he couldn't outrun justice. Through the relentless work of detectives, forensic scientists, and the courage of victims who came forward, Key was finally unmasked, his reign of terror brought to an end. For the families of Paula Hilera, Johannes Castro, and Rashida Washington, the pain of their loss will never fade. No prison sentence, no court ruling can bring back their daughters. But their fight for justice ensured that Key would never harm another innocent life again. This case is also a testament to the power of forensic science. DNA evidence, which had once been an emerging tool, became the key to solving a series of crimes that might have otherwise gone unanswered. It serves as a stark warning to criminals. No matter how long they evade capture, the truth will eventually come to light. If there's one lesson to be learned, it's that justice prevails when people refuse to give up. Investigators could have let these cases grow cold, but they didn't. Families could have been silenced by grief, but they fought back. Communities could have ignored the signs, but they spoke up. And because of their efforts, a serial predator was stopped. If you suspect something, say something. If you have information, share it. If you or someone you know has been a victim, seek help. Because no matter how much time passes, no matter how hopeless a case may seem, justice is always within reach.